Our next presentation is by Doug Williams. So Doug works at BT and as part of their research and innovation team. During a long career with BT, Doug has had many roles, but taking the long view, he now perceives his career as having two phases. In the first phase, from 1987 through to about 1995, whilst he was working on the design and fabrication of special fibres, Doug was trying to ensure that technology options were available to allow networks to have near infinite capacity. Since 1995, Doug has been trying to be very rational about which such infinite capacity is needed. This rational approach has two prongs. The first prong, which is quite analytical, aims to help the company understand the real difference that having very high capacity connections in the access network makes to people. The second prong, which is more creative, is to help people imagine and develop immersive, compelling and fun experiences that happen to use lots of bandwidth. In this presentation, Doug will talk about how really high bandwidth will positively affect our experience. And as a footnote, which Doug mentioned yesterday, he keeps goats and consequently spends more time than most spent staring at them. So there we go.
I've only just decided to put this slide in, but has anyone any idea how many watts your home can cope with? What's the maximum power required by your home? What's the flow of water into your home that you need? These aren't things that concern you, but we do get obsessed by the speed, the maximum bandwidth that we've got connected to our home, and we're held to account for it. I think it's an interesting kind of parallel. We shouldn't really need to worry about it, but we do. This title is deliberately horrible. It's an ironic one. I hate seeing exploding data and other phrases like that in the literature and in the news. And I wrote it in an ironic way, and perhaps I should learn that you don't use ironic titles. Get stuck with them and people think that you mean those phrases. But I am interested in how much bandwidth we need, and I'm interested, I tried to rephrase it, what difference does having really high bandwidth make? And then what you need to make the judgment on is that worth funding a network for? So, sort of three parts here. One is, and I'm going to sort of try and identify the gap between not enough and too much, and what's just about right. And identifying what's just about right involves, for me, trying to model how much bandwidth I really think we're going to need now, but also in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And we have to characterise some of that bandwidth as well. In the modelling, I'm looking at key drivers for bandwidth, browsing, VOD, gaming, live sport, mobile apps, OS updates, all over things. And I've had to look at a lot of them and think, well, what is it today that we really need? And what difference would high bandwidth make to that service? Even higher bandwidth, what difference would it make? And then trying to come to a sort of prediction out to about 2030 and thinking, what do we think really makes a difference? So here's a car on the left, a Trabant. I think you can seat 4 people in it. It probably achieves the average speed that is available on the UK road network. Who wants one? No hands. The Q7 is about the size of a small house and is too big and is ugly and is more desirable. The Trabant nobody wants, and it's usually not good enough. The Q7 is usually too much, but somewhere in between there's a gap. And it's the same with networks. So normally, good enough is normally not good enough kind of thing. But what's excessive? So in modelling all this, well, I tried to take the view of going back to people. Let's look at people. Let's look at what's happening in people's homes. Let's look at their devices. And let's see if we can sort of anticipate for the things that they're doing which causes bandwidth, what's going to happen. So some of you may be familiar with the Laga, Arga, Saga, Gaga sort of classification, segmentation of ages of people. The alternative was Shakespeare's Ages of Man, but I think there's 7 of them, so 4 was easier. the age we are, as we've seen from Ofcom and lots of other people, makes a big difference on the kind of services we use at the moment. And it's worth bearing in mind that different people at different life stages have different needs and different habits. Some of those habits and needs will migrate and may move into old we take with us. Some will let go. So it's difficult sometimes to anticipate the impact of ages, but different age households do have different requirements at the moment. So we have to bear in mind the type of household we've got. Then we need to look at what's happening inside any house and how many users, what type of services are they using, how frequently they are using them, and for how long are they using them. Because all of these have a big impact on the total bandwidth that you're going to need. If you go back to the water analogy, if you want to fill up a bath very quickly and you've got 12 baths, then obviously that's going to create one kind of requirement for how much water you need, and something else would happen if you only had 2 baths. So the sort of applications that we're going to look at in a moment is browsing, TV, large file download and gaming. And I'm just trying to go through those, and we'll try and get to a stage where we think, well, the bandwidth we'll regularly need is perhaps this much. And the bandwidth that you'd occasionally appreciate is this much. Kind of careful use of words, and particularly that appreciate, because it's probably not absolutely necessary, but you might notice the difference and enjoy it. So going back to our segmentation, this is from not this year's report, but last year's CMR. So I'll explain how these numbers work. Not everyone has got access to the internet. Not everyone uses the internet. Most people have got access to it, but some of them choose not to take that access. It's about 90% of people have got broadband or some kind of internet connectivity. If your household is 18 to 34, the oldest person in it is 18 to 34, everyone, as far as I can work out, everyone of that age will have internet connectivity, and that's about 16% of the whole population. So you can see how that works. So winding across, when you get to people over 65, about 70% of them have got internet access, and that's about 22% of the whole population. So when you start adding that up, you can see that just about everyone's got access to broadband or uses the internet. About 40% of us play games. A very small percent of us actually got HD services live in our house. Of course, that will change. There was a question. Somebody was asking me, who was it? I think it was George. Were you saying, will the characterisation of bandwidth change from just being speed to being something else? Will we start talking about jitter? Will we start talking about latency? Will we start talking about other things? Going through this process forced me to think about bandwidth and its nature, not necessarily in those terms, but it has got a number of characteristics. Which is it symmetrical? For how long am I going to need this bandwidth? How often am I going to need this bandwidth? Is this bandwidth which I'm causing actively, something I'm doing, or is it something that happens on its own and I didn't do anything about it? Is this service or the bandwidth, is it adaptable? Can it adjust itself and still deliver a service, or can it not? And kind of how critical is it? The whole load of I'm not quite sure if I've used quite the right words, but these blobs will move around as we move through these services and analyse what we're doing. I'm going to start with just browsing. There's a great archive called the HTTP archive, which analyses the size of web pages over the years, and it shows that surprise, they're growing and they're getting bigger with images and more video and all the rest of it, and they're growing fairly linearly. Some very clever things happen in the building of web pages and the putting them on your screen. But from a personal viewpoint, and I don't mean mine, but the viewpoint of a person, in terms of interaction, for it to be a good experience, I want to go click one there. It's there, so I'm reading it. So I want 1 second is a good experience before I'm now got that web page and looking at it and assessing where I need to be on it. Now, while I'm assessing it, what's happening is that the page is continuing to load and the scripts behind it are happening and other things are going on. So the page doesn't all need to load in a second, but enough of it needs to load in a second that I get the impression that I can start interacting with it and assessing it. And if you look at the web pages and how big they are and how much of it you need to fill the page, and you adopt terms from advertising and marketing, paper advertising, you talk about above and below the fold. So above the fold is the stuff that immediately comes to you. If you get that in a second, it's very difficult for that to require more than 16 megs, even as you wind forward in a few years' time. For a simple web page, even if it's beginning to play a video, it's kind of difficult to imagine that you really need more than 16 megs. And at the moment, and I know this from personal experience, living where I am with my goats, in the end of a no-through road where broadband has struggled to get to, I've brought up 3 children, and I've had teenagers, and they're all subscribers to Netflix, and we have coped with 3 megs. Now, people don't like to believe that because they think everyone thinks you need loads and loads. I've now got superfast broadband and I get 7 megs because I'm still a long, long way from the cabinet. 3 megs is enough to deliver VOD services onto a 46-inch screen and for teenagers to be grateful that they can see it. There is an issue sometimes when somebody says, who's streaming? Because I can't, so we have to find that out. So you can't do concurrent streams, that's difficult. Not with 3, but 1 you can. No one's ever complained that they can't browse unless someone's hogging all the bandwidth for streaming. So we know that 3 megs, and my experience of browsing at home is very much the same as it is at work. Has been for a long time. So having more bandwidth at work, having access to a gig uncontested line at work, which we sometimes do, doesn't change my browsing experience. So what difference does really high bandwidth make to browsing? Diddly squat. What about video on demand? Now, I think we probably all know all this stuff, but I'm going to take you through it anyway, step you through it. Increasing efficiency of codecs means that we see decreases in the bandwidth required to encode a video over time at a constant perceptual quality for fidelity. About 5% a year. A guy's written everyone's got a law. There's a law for all of these things. There's McCann's law, which says that the efficiency of coding tends to go down by about 5% a year. Changes a little bit. But if you look at these curves, you take a line across 2018, you can get an acceptable quality video with a couple of 3 megs. And premium services, and 4K services, we're delivering on VOD somewhere between about 11 and 15. So Netflix advises you to have about 18 megs, and they talk about 15. If you start measuring 4K videos that you can download through YouTube, you can get them for about 11, somewhere between 11 and 18, 17, depending how many people encode them. So those numbers are what happens today. And one of the other things, alternative trend I want to put on top of this, which goes the opposite direction, is this idea of what's acceptable, what's a premium quality, and what's very good. Because you will always have a premium quality, and you will always have an acceptable quality. And back in 2000 or 2006, when Sky first started launching, when Sky first started supporting HD, HD was the premium service. You paid extra to get HD. You paid extra to get 1080p video. And the bandwidth that they needed was about 8 megs or something to do that. And today, if I want the premium service, I want the premium service on 4K and go to Netflix or Amazon and get their 4K services, I need about 15, 11. So it moves up. It has moved up. And my analysis, it's moved up because we've got more pixels and expectations are going up. So my analysis of this is that the idea of a premium service and a very good service and an acceptable service, the bandwidth you'll need to deliver those will slowly creep up because our expectations will go up, but not massively. So when you're looking out to 2030, 35 there, we're talking 30, 35 megs for the premium service. One possible difference there is that head-mounted displays might make a difference. I'll explain why, but head-mounted displays might require a lot more bandwidth. There's some data on this we've been measuring at work recently, just about how much we need for each stream. It feels very much in these numbers are right. And Netflix also publish an average stream width for at peak time. What is the average stream width that they broadcast? And they publish this per ISP to try and embarrass ISPs to say you ought to provide a better network. But what it shows is that their immense focus on providing really well encoded and efficiently encoded video. Their average stream width is about 4 megs today. And their average stream is more than acceptable. Not many people complain about the quality of Netflix. I may be in a room where people are very heightened to this, and I do, but Netflix is great. You get what you want when you want it, and I'm enjoying it, and I can see the story, and I can hear the story, and that's what I want. I'm not complaining about the video quality. 4 megs. It's really quite modest. So where that leads me with respect to video is that there's two things going on the bar chart at the bottom right. That's kind of different types of video, and that's about time usage and how much of our viewing time is taken up with different forms of TV watching, whatever. The yellow is kind of broadcast, and it's in decline. Where it's going was the question I asked the Ofcom guy, and he wouldn't tell me the answer, but who knows? But it's kind of on the decline and going down, and that makes a difference to how many hours a day I'm going to be demanding that bandwidth. And the graph at the top tells you what bandwidth I'll demand when I'm demanding that bandwidth. But these numbers are not massive. And even if I'm watching 2 streams at home, if I watch 2 average streams, 8, 10 megs. If I'm watching 2 premium streams, quite unlikely, to be honest. And if it's VOD, 30, 40 megs. It's slightly different, and Andy, you may ask this at the end. I'm anticipating your question. Other Andy. It is Andy, isn't it? Something, yeah. About delay. So the cost of this really good encoding is a delay. It takes time. So for live services, perhaps there's a different argument, and there may be a different compromise. But for VOD services, it's very difficult to argue that huge bandwidths make a big difference. Now let's look at this funny circle at the top right. A lot of different squares in there. The little green square in the middle. Well, let me say that whole circle is my field of view. So if you want to know how big your field of view is, you can do this with your arms and move them forward until you can see your fingers. You can see your fingers moving. I'm not looking at my fingers, I'm looking at you at the back. But I can see my fingers I know they're moving. So your field of view is kind of like this. When I'm watching TV, and that field of view is the largest sort of funny square thing. The blue line is my field of view. It takes it's about 150 degrees, north and south and east and west. You can see nearly everything. The amount that I can see when I'm looking at a 32-inch TV, when I'm sitting at a normal distance, it fills a very small fraction of my field of view, that little green square. Now, TVs have actually got bigger. We're probably sitting at about 46-inch TVs. So of my whole field of view, you can see that it takes up quite a small fraction. That small fraction of 46-inch TV is actually about the same fraction at which I can get maximum resolution using my eyesight. And that's not to do with my eyesight, that's to do with everyone's eyesight. In terms of how much of the field of view you can actually resolve and get maximum resolution, it is a tiny fraction. It's your foveal... They call it something clever, some phrase. There's only a small part of my field of view where I can actually resolve things very tightly. Happens to correlate with about a TV viewed from about 2.4 metres. So the TV as it is, I can resolve those pixels, the maximum quality I can get. And at 4K, I cannot resolve those pixels viewed at the usual difference. If we start using much, much bigger screens, then suddenly I might be able to resolve the pixels at 4K. So to not be able to resolve the pixels, I need more pixels. And the same is true of head-mounted displays, which can offer really high fields of view. And that's why head-mounted displays may be a candidate for demanding much higher bandwidths. But I think we heard a talk yesterday from UCL, where there's lots and lots of clever encoding schemes which take account of the fact that while I may have that amount of field of view in view, I can't really focus on it because my eyes cannot resolve the pixels because it's peripheral. So there's lots of encoding schemes which cope with that. I mean, I don't need to afford the same level of bandwidth for the stuff at the edges to the stuff in the middle. So it doesn't just scale with the field with the field of view because it's cleverer than that. The system's cleverer than that, provided you can adapt quickly to when I move focus. Because if I look over there now, that needs to be sharply in focus, or it needs to be sharply in focus quite soon. So there are schemes which means that you're going to need more bandwidth, but you're not going to need loads and loads more bandwidth. It's not going to be like 10, 20, 30 times, but perhaps it will go up to 100 megs. So if you had a gigabit network, what difference would that make to my experience? Well, I don't need a gigabit network, I would argue, to be able to get really good field of view through a head-mounted display, really good image. And what's more, I don't think I'm going to be looking on those silly glasses at anything for very long. People said that virtual reality's gone quiet for the moment. It has, hasn't it? And I think it's just the glasses is a huge barrier. Until we get over that, we're not going to need those high bandwidths for video. Now, when it comes to mobile apps, and pretty much the same will be true for games and OSs when I come to it, quite a different story. Apps are getting bigger, the applications that we use on our phones, and more devices around our homes are using apps. If I am actively updating apps, that's when I start to think, yes, I've pressed this button and now I want this new app. How am I prepared to wait? What's a reasonable time? I want to give people a good experience. What is it, a couple of minutes? I don't know. How big's that app? How long does it take to come down? What's happening in 10 years' time? That app's probably getting bigger. The software storage, the device on the storage on our devices is getting bigger, and I'm using the rate at which our storage on our devices grows as a proxy for how much bigger, how fast apps will get bigger. If our patience gets worse, so we're more impatient, and you combine those two, you can get to sort of some kind of estimate of the way that you think the bandwidth you require to download apps will go up. And that goes up perhaps to about 300 megs by about 2030. But that's in the scenario where I'm actively pressing something and waiting for it to come down. For most of the app updates that I get, it's all happening for me, and probably for many of you, in the background and have nothing to do with it. I was awake at 2 o'clock the other day, and I noticed that a lot of my apps were updating. I hadn't done anything. It probably does that every night. So that fast download, that 300 megs, is necessary when I've pressed the button. But if they're all updating on their own, it's kind of irrelevant. I will occasionally want the new app, and I will occasionally want it fast. Is it worth building and dimensioning a network just for that, just for me to save 10 minutes? That's the question we have to ask. Pretty much the same question with bandwidth for operating system updates. Again, the numbers as I've crunched them, same principles. Operating systems tend to get bigger. Our patience is going to go down. If it's an active process where I've pressed a button and I'm supervising it, I want it fast, I probably need about 300 megs by the time about 2030. But it isn't clear. Oh no, and games is almost true, the same thing. So games are huge files, and I want them now. Sometimes I want them now. I might sit down and decide that I want to play a game on my Xbox or PlayStation. I'll press a button and I expect that game to be with me in 2 minutes so I can start playing. Is it 2 minutes or is it 10 minutes? People are a bit more tolerant of game downloads. They know they're big. There's two things that are happening. One is that more and more gaming is actually being streamed, so I don't need to download the whole game to start playing it. And that just becomes a bit like video, because what I'm doing is shifting moving pixels to the screen in front of me in order to play the game. The control that I've got through my thumbs is going back to a network-based server. It's rendering something and send it back to me. If you can do it fast enough, and there is a challenge, but many of those challenges are being met and overcome, I don't need to download the whole game. I just need to play it, and it's a bit like video. So my arguments about bandwidth would reduce to being the same as for video. If we continue to download games, then you may need significantly higher bandwidths, and you may need to be downloading at 500 megs a gig to download a game very, very quickly. People don't download that many games. So is it worth building a network to meet that 1 gigabit per second target for the 2 or 3 games that people might download per year, just so they can save 20 minutes when actually the world may move on so that we're all network streaming anyway? You may hear that I'm finding it difficult to find situations where 1 gigabit would make a lot of difference to my experience. And it won't make a lot of difference to my experience very often, and it won't. Not having 1 gigabit would how much of my year would it ruin? 20 minutes, 40 minutes? And it wouldn't ruin it. It would just mean not happening, things aren't quite happening as quickly as I'd like. It would be better, but how much better? And how much am I prepared to pay for that? And if I'm not prepared to pay for it, then how is the network provider going to get that money back? These are quite difficult challenges. So a sort of prediction, okay? I reckon that we'll regularly need about 70 megs. You'll regularly find yourself, when you start totting all these things up and seeing the things that are likely to happen at the same time and have significant persistence, last for many minutes, and therefore likely to overlap each other, and you start layering these services which are happening, you're regularly going to use 70 megs. Occasionally, you may appreciate bursting to a much higher bandwidth. For me, that creates lots of interesting suggestions here, like perhaps ponds are a really good architecture for a fibre distribution. You could do that. You've still got to put fibre in, unfortunately. Perhaps radios are a really good distribution, because with the 5G capacities that we're talking about, perhaps for the 10 minutes that I'm downloading my game, I could grab all of the frequency, and I could, for those 10 minutes, I can have that and download my game quickly, and then I'm off the network and it's back for somebody else's. But is it worth building a 1 gigabit network to every home all the time or more, just for those 10 minutes, 3 times a year? Of course, logic, in terms of pure engineering logic, is not what drives all of this. It's economics, and it's kind of a bit like Andy was saying about you've got different architectures. There's a commercial architecture into which this must fit. And if we've got a provider who's providing a higher bandwidth than me, I'm going to lose market share, I'm going to go out of business, I need to compete. So if there is a Virgin in the room, I shouldn't have said that, doesn't sound right, does it? A Virgin, how do I get out of that one? If Virgin is there and they're offering 300 megs, and for the same price I'm only offering 80, I've probably got to compete on those bases, just on purely commercial grounds. Not entirely logical, but that's kind of the space we're in. I'm struggling in all this to really find applications for where 1 gigabits would make a big difference to a user's experience, even when I'm trying to extrapolate that out to 2030. And that's kind of my conclusion. Thank you.